A man is thrown into a massive cauldron, the surface of the water bubbling and steaming. At first, there's a desperate cry for mercy, but as his body sinks deeper, the boiling water strips away skin and flesh in an agonizing, relentless process. This method is used for the most hardened criminals, political enemies, accused witches, and religious heretics. Case in point, this is not just an execution, it's a performance of pain designed to send a terrifying message of unimaginable suffering to those who have sinned. But this is just one of the many horrifying torture methods used throughout history. The brazen bull. In the world of torture, few devices rival the terror of the brazen bull. Forged in ancient Greece by the inventor Paralus of Athens, this bronze monstrosity was designed for the tyrant Phalaris of Acragas. Shaped like a life-sized bull, it had a dark purpose. Victims were locked inside, while a fire beneath the bull roasted them alive. Ingeniously cruel, the bull's pipes distorted their agonized screams, entertaining the tormentors. Legend says Paralus himself became the bull's first victim, tricked into testing his creation. Fittingly, Phalaris also met his fiery end in the bull when overthrown. The Romans later adopted the brazen bull, using it to martyr Christians, including Saint Eustache, said to endure 3 days of agony before death. Though some accounts are debated as legend, this is probably the most horrifying imaginations ever. The Iron Maiden. Imagine a peasant in the Middle Ages struggling in a world of famine and drought, watches as his children slowly starve. The rulers, waging wars, demand ever higher taxes, and the people are crushed under the weight. But when a handful of peasants decided to gather and discuss their suffering, they were branded as traitors. Tortured on the rack, they confessed to nothing more than seeking relief. The nobles, brainstorming the most horrific way to make an example of them, settle on the Iron Maiden, a spiked box that produces a slow, agonizing death. This coffin-like box is lined with spikes. As the door slams shut, the sharp iron impales their flesh. Blood streams from tiny holes, feeding the crowd's fear. The rack. Among the list of torment, the rack is one of history's most feared instruments of suffering. A device employed across centuries, designed not to kill, but to break the mind and body. The purpose is to force confessions, often from criminals, slaves, or prisoners of war, but oftentimes the truth was irrelevant. The rack itself looks like a large ladder, but its steps were scary. These bars rotated like the rolling pins of damnation. A prisoner, bound by their wrists and ankles, would be tied into a ratcheting pulley system. Here, 2 officials, cold and deliberate, would tighten the ropes, turn by agonizing turn, each twist forcing unnatural strain into the prisoner's shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows. When their agony becomes unbearable, prisoners would utter whatever they thought their captors wanted to hear. Sometimes, this desperate gamble spared them. More often, it condemned them further, labeled as liars and tortured again. The end result was almost always the same. Prisoners left the rack shattered, limbs dislocated, some rendered permanently paralyzed. The pear of anguish. An infamous device claimed to have been used in medieval Europe was said to inflict excruciating pain by forcibly widening a victim's orifice, be it the mouth, vagina, or anus. A torturer inserting the cold, metallic instrument and turning its screw to expand the pear, tearing flesh and inducing unbearable agony. But how much of this terrifying tale is rooted in truth? Scholars now cast doubt on the true origins of the pear of anguish. While it's been labeled a medieval instrument of torment, evidence points to its creation in the early modern period, after the Middle Ages ended around 1450. Intriguingly, surviving examples of these devices included coiled springs, a feature that suggests advanced craftsmanship not associated with medieval methods. Adding to the mystery, the availability of these artifacts is strange, and their design raises questions about their actual functionality as tools of torture. The Judas cradle. Among the most excruciating torture devices of the medieval era, the Judas cradle stands out for its sheer brutality. Originally known as the Spanish donkey or cavallero squarciapale, it was a triangular pyramid mounted on a sawhorse-like structure. Designed by Ippolito Marsili during the Spanish Inquisition, it was one of the most sophisticated instruments of its time. The victim, naked and suspended by ropes, was slowly lowered onto the sharp, pointed tip of the pyramid. Gravity did its part, as the device targeted the most sensitive areas of the body, causing unbearable pain. The victim's body weight would force them further onto the point, stretching and impaling them. This device, often used for public humiliation, was sometimes carried through the streets in a display of torture. Though originally intended to disturb sleep, it became a tool for suffering, used throughout the Inquisition to break both body and spirit. Flaying. In the Middle Ages, flaying, though rare, served as a powerful symbol in art and literature, capturing the dramatic relationship between skin and identity. Skin is not just a barrier, it's the surface on which one's identity is formed. To remove it is to erase or transform that identity, turning beauty into horror or monstrosity into potential beauty. Flaying in the pre-modern world explores both human and animal exoration, examining its laws, instruments, and the profound implications it held in the medieval context. The collection delves into notorious cases, such as the brutal execution of Peter Stubb, condemned as a werewolf and murderer, and the horrific fate of Venetian general Marco Antonio Bragadin, flayed by Turkish invaders. Saw torture. Throughout history, humanity has elevated cruelty to a dark art form, constantly inventing new ways to prolong suffering. One of the most horrifying tools of torment is the saw. Its purpose twisted from utility to brutality not long after its invention in the 31st century BC. In ancient Persia, under Darius II, sawing became an executioner's nightmare. Victims were bound and hung upside down, their bodies methodically torn apart by the blade. Yet such atrocities didn't end in prehistoric times. During the Hungarian Revolution of 1848, women, children, and elderly men were reportedly mutilated and sawn into pieces. Punishments ranged from severing fingers to entire limbs, often as a warning to others. For those condemned to die, flailing victims became a practical problem that executioners solved with ingenuity. Rat torture. This was yet another dark chapter of punishment within the dark walls of the Tower of London. At the infamous tower, the Dungeon of the Rats became a place of accidental torment. Rising tides from the Thames flooded the dungeon, drawing lots of ravenous rats to be imprisoned. Trapped in darkness, prisoners could do little as these creatures feast on their flesh. The guards surely knew, but perhaps they saw this as justice served. Elsewhere, deliberate rat torture reached horrifying extremes. During the Dutch Revolt, torturer Diedrich Sene reportedly strapped starved rats onto prisoners' bellies beneath an inverted bowl. With hot coals at the top of the bowl, the rats panicked and desperately burrowed into the victim's flesh to escape. The heretic's fork. The heretic's fork is a terrifying device of medieval torture that was primarily used during the Inquisitions to extract confessions. It consisted of a metal rod with two sharp prongs, each attached to a leather strap worn around the victim's neck. One prong was positioned under the chin, while the other dug into the breastbone, forcing the victim to keep their head upright at all times. The design ensured excruciating pain. Victims were often suspended or restrained, unable to lie down. Any movement of the jaw would drive the prongs deeper into the flesh, intensifying the agony. Though the fork did not hit vital organs, it caused extreme discomfort, as blood loss was minimal and the victim was deprived of sleep. Eventually, death came not from bleeding, but from exhaustion and mental collapse. This cruel tool kept the victim alive for long periods, prolonging their suffering in the name of punishment and forced confession. Scaphism. One time, a corrupt and unrepentant judge, Sisamnes, was flayed alive by King Cambyses II of Persia. His skin stretched into a dangerous chair as a warning to future judges. Betray justice and you too will wear the seat of shame. Even darker is the story of Mithridates, a young Persian soldier condemned to the unimaginable horrors of Scaphism. For the crime of accidentally killing Cyrus the Younger in battle, he was entombed between two boats, his head and limbs exposed to the burning sun. Force-fed with milk and honey, his body became a feast for swarms of flies, wasps, and worms. Rotting in his own filth, he endured 17 days of agonizing decay, devoured alive by insects and vermin. Breaking wheel or Catherine wheel? According to legend, the Catherine wheel is named after Saint Catherine of Alexandria, a scholar who defied Emperor Maxentius during his persecution of Christians. Imprisoned for her defiance, she converted soldiers and even the emperor's wife, sealing her fate. The wheel, meant to execute her, miraculously shattered, forcing Maxentius to have her beheaded instead. Also known as the breaking wheel, it was no miracle for many people. A massive wooden device with iron rims or blades, it shattered bones and inflicted unimaginable pain. Victims were either crushed beneath its weight or tied to it, their limbs broken with iron bars. Executioners often prolonged the agony, displaying the mangled remains as a warning to other offenders. Bodies were left to rot, devoured by scavengers, denying souls eternal peace. Rarely, malfunctions were seen as divine intervention, sparing the condemned. Used for centuries, the wheel's horror was known for years until it was outlawed in the 19th century. Impalement. A brutal form of torture and execution, was most infamously employed by Vlad the Impaler, the former ruler of Wallachia. Reserved for those accused of crimes against the state, it was one of the most horrific methods of death. Contrary to popular belief, impalement was not a quick end. With precise execution, victims could survive for days as the pole, carefully guided through the body, avoided vital organs. The choice of pole was crucial. Depending on the region and time, wooden stakes or metal poles were used, often sharpened for easier insertion. In some cases, multiple poles would be driven through the body at once, creating a gruesome torture. The garrote. Hanging, one of the oldest forms of execution, has been used for centuries across various cultures. While it often resulted in death by neck fracture from a noose, it could also serve as a tool of torture when intended. In medieval times, for severe crimes like high treason, hanging was preceded by the horrific punishment of being drawn and quartered, where the prisoner was dismembered alive before the final execution. Another common method, the garrote, involved a mechanical device that slowly strangled the victim, causing painful suffocation and damage to blood vessels. Today, the garrote remains a form of execution in certain parts of the world, like Delaware, New Hampshire, and Washington. In the US, a prisoner may choose between hanging or lethal injection, though hanging is rarely used. The process involves precise calculations based on the prisoner's weight, ensuring a quick death by neck dislocation or asphyxiation, if executed correctly. Without proper measurement, however, strangulation and severe suffering may result. Crocodile shears. Imagine a pair of iron pincers about a foot long with blades shaped like half cylinders. At first glance, they seem harmless, but their design is anything but innocent. Lined with sharp, teeth-like protrusions, these shears mimic the crushing bite of a crocodile, hence the terrifying name crocodile shears. But the true horror lies in their intended use. These were no tools for the garden. The shears were crafted to cause excruciating pain, targeting fingers, toes, and even the most sensitive parts of the body. When clamped shut, they inflicted bone-crushing force, tearing flesh and leaving victims maimed and broken. Historical records are sparse, but it's believed the crocodile shears were used for the gravest crimes: treason, regicide, and other high offenses. To make matters worse, the thought of these shears being heated before use only heightens the dread. The torture chair. The iron chair, also known as the armchair of inquiries, was one of the most feared torture devices of Europe's Middle Ages, used as late as the 1800s. It was known by many names, including the Chinese torture chair and the Judas chair. Its true power lay not in physical pain alone, but in the overwhelming psychological terror it instilled. Victims were often forced to watch others endure its agony before being seated themselves. The chair was studded with anywhere from 500 to 1,500 sharp spikes. Once seated, the victim's wrists were tightly bound and their body pushed against the spikes by bars or restraints, sometimes with added weight on their legs. Torture could last for hours or even days. For added cruelty, the chair's spikes could be heated, turning it into a furnace that burned deep into the victim's flesh. Lingchi, or death by 1,000 cuts. Lingchi, or slow slicing, was a brutal execution method used in China for centuries. The condemned person was tied to a post, and over time, pieces of skin and limbs were sliced away, often ending with a fatal blow to the heart or decapitation. This horrific practice, used as early as the 10th century, persisted for nearly 1,000 years before it was officially banned in 1905. The head crusher. The cranium crusher was a brutal instrument of torture used during the Middle Ages, particularly in the Spanish Inquisition. This metal device featured a plate placed under the victim's jaw connected to a head cap. As the torturer turned a screw, the gap between the plate and the cap slowly closed, crushing the skull, teeth, and facial bones. Even if the torturer stopped short of death, the victim's facial structure would be permanently damaged. The process would continue, crushing the jaw and eventually the skull, causing excruciating pain and possibly causing the victim's eyes to bulge from their sockets. Some versions of the device even included small containers to catch the eyes as they were forced out. The victim, broken and crushed, would often be ready to cooperate with interrogators after only a few turns of the screw. The Spanish donkey. At first glance, the Spanish donkey may appear harmless, but its true horrors are revealed upon closer inspection. Like a pommel horse with a sharp, triangular point facing upwards, this medieval device was designed to inflict unimaginable pain. Used primarily during the Spanish Inquisition, it soon spread to North America, where it was even employed by popular figures like George Washington. Also known as the wooden horse or the mule, the Spanish donkey was one of the most agonizing forms of torture ever devised. While it was mostly used on women, men were subjected to it as well. The victim, stripped naked, would straddle the sharp edge of the device, their body forced into a painful, vulnerable position. Weights or restraints were often tied to their ankles, intensifying the agony. Prolonged torture on the Spanish donkey could result in severe disfigurement or even death, as the sharp edge gradually sliced into the victim's body. Boiling alive. In 16th century England, during a time of wealth, a cook became popular for his dark story. Case in point, he was a chef for a powerful nobleman, preparing a feast for his esteemed guests. One evening, everything went horrible after 17 people collapsed, became violently ill, and some died. After being accused of poisoning the food, he was sentenced to a very gruesome punishment: death by boiling. The cook, Richard Roos, talked about his innocence, claiming he added a powder he thought was a harmless laxative, possibly given by a stranger. Later on, after being tortured on the rack, he confessed, but many believed he was a pawn in a far larger political game, perhaps orchestrated by King Henry VIII himself. On April 15th, 1532, Roos's execution began. Suspended in chains, he was lowered into boiling water 3 separate times, his screams heard by the crowd. The gruesome process took 2 hours. Spectators were horrified, women fainted, and others were sick. Ever since that day, boiling alive became a dark legend never to be used against any offender, no matter the crime.